All right, hello everybody. Welcome to lecture 5, the Infidels, the Images, and the Vikings. This is obviously being done a little bit differently than normal. As you will recall, we did not have class this past Tuesday night. Unfortunately, I got hit with a bit of the flu that has had me out most of the week. Today is Friday when I'm finally recording this, and I'm finally able to be out and about. Still feeling a little bit in my throat and glands and everything like that. So if I pause this video and then have to resume it, it's only because I had to step out of the room and have a good hack uh, to clear things up. But I've really missed being in class with all of you guys. And you know what's so weird is that normally when I lecture in class, I'm looking at you guys, and now I'm just looking at a computer screen. And so I don't know whether to look at this black eyeball that is the camera at the top of my computer or at the screen at myself. So I don't know if I keep looking back and forth. That's why. But what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just go over the lecture notes. This probably won't be as long as a full lecture, whereas if we were in class. And when I send out the link for this, you will also have those lecture notes with you as well. But this is going to be, again, lecture 5, the Infidels, the Images, and the Vikings. And so there's 3 main areas of church history we're going to cover. And if you're looking at the notes, I'm going to ask you to begin on page 2 with the rise of Islam. Now, this is, of course, a class about the rise of the church, but in the 7th century, there arises a new force that the church is going to really be growing up with throughout the rest of its life. You might say, kind of a younger brother that the church will be sharing a room with for a long time to come, including up to the present day. And that is, of course, the force of Islam, beginning with the figure known as Muhammad. Muhammad was born in the year 570 and lived to about 632. As of today, Christianity and Islam actually are the 2 largest religions in the world. Christianity makes up about 31% of the world's population, and Islam is in second place with 24%, although that number is rapidly growing. So I think in order to understand Islam, though, we have to talk about the life of Muhammad. Muhammad was born in Mecca, Saudi Arabia in 570. The culture in which he was born was very polytheistic. The Arabs at the time actually had all sorts of idols and gods that they worshiped. And even as a young man, Muhammad saw this as a very serious derivation from their heritage because the Arabs were actually the descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael. If you know the biblical story of Ishmael, he was the illegitimate son of Hagar, and then Isaac was the promised son of Abraham's wife, Sarah. And so, just as Ishmael and Isaac, there's sort of this rivalry there in the Bible. That rivalry had kind of played out over time as well. And the Arabs were the proud descendants of Ishmael, and they claimed that really the truth had been passed down through them. But there's a very sacred spot in Mecca known as the Kaaba, which is still around to this day. And that supposedly was a place of worship that was built by Abraham and Ishmael. We don't find this story in the Bible, but that was according to Arab tradition. Now, so as a young man, Mohammed is a little confused because he knows about this place, the Kaaba. He hears about the God of Abraham and the God of Ishmael, and he knows there's only supposed to be one God. God makes that very clear in the Abrahamic stories. And yet he looks around him and he sees idolatry everywhere. And so from a young age, he's nagged by this need for reform of calling his kinsfolk back to monotheism. Now, when he was 25 years old, he goes to work for this 40-year-old widow whose name was Khadijah, and they end up getting married. Um, so he marries his 40-year-old widow, and then about 15 years later, when Muhammad is himself 40, he's spending time on top of a mountain and he's meditating, he's praying, and then according to Muhammad, the angel Gabriel appears and gives him a message from God. The message was this: quote, recite in the name of your Lord who creates man from a clot. Recite, for your Lord is most gracious. Muhammad wasn't really sure if he had actually heard from God. Had he just been up where the oxygen levels were a little too low and he was imagining things or what? Uh, and at this point, we should probably note that when Muhammad speaks about God, he would use the word Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. But as Muhammad was kind of wrestling with doubts about this, his wife Khadijah actually encouraged him to listen and to pay attention and take this seriously. And so over the next 3 years, Muhammad supposedly receives more visions from the angel Gabriel, and but doesn't go public with them right away. He doesn't really know how people are going to respond to that. But then eventually, after a couple of years, he does begin preaching these things. And what he begins preaching is a very sharp monotheism. And as you can imagine, the polygamous folks are not polygamous, uh, uh, polytheistic, thank you, polytheistic folks around him respond very poorly to this. And so at first, what's interesting was that there's such hostility between Muslims and Jews today. At first, Muhammad actually has some decent allies in the Jews because they're both preaching one God in the midst of these idolatrous systems. But as time goes by, it becomes pretty obvious that they're not talking about the same God. It became very difficult to reconcile their faith systems, and so Muhammad really kind of goes off and does his own thing. And this new faith, which is called Islam, and Islam is the word submission. Now, for the first 13 years of this Islamic mission, Muhammad primarily does that in the city of Mecca, where he's from, and he does that through peaceful, nonviolent means. He didn't really take up the sword, didn't do much fighting, but something dramatically changed in the year 622. In 622, Muhammad and his followers fled from Mecca to a city called Medina in an event called the Hijra, which is now a landmark event in Islam. It's a huge part of their calendar. It's actually regarded as the start of their calendar year. And I probably totally mispronounced it, so apologize if any cultural sensitivities are offended there. But once Muhammad and his troop get settled in Medina, the folks in Mecca are still kind of lashing out at them. They're like, yeah, you may have left, but we're still going to give you a hard time even from a distance. And so at that point, kind of you've been poking the bear for too long. And then Muhammad said, all right, guys, here's an update. I just got word from Allah, and now we're allowed to use violence. So at that point, Muhammad's campaign strategy shifts from basically peaceful non-resistance to now they have permission to take up the sword and defend themselves. And going forward, his advances would be strongly military in nature. And that militant action, it's debated just how strong it was in Muhammad, but there's very little doubt that it certainly intensified in the leaders after him. They were known as the caliphs. And there were multiple factors involved in the spread of Islam. There, economic trade and interaction with other groups certainly played a part. But there's no doubt that one of the main components in the early spread of Islam was its military nature. Now, even though Muhammad's military involvement is something that's very hotly debated, some people say he just did it all in defense. Others say no, he was quite aggressive. When you read those accounts, it's pretty evident Muhammad is somewhat of a warlord. But there's one thing that it's really hard for anybody to explain away, and that is that after his wife died, he ended up going on to have as many as 9 wives at one time, which is interesting because according to Muhammad in the Quran, you could have multiple wives, but only up to 4. But what's interesting is one of those wives was a young girl named Aisha. When I say young girl, I mean she was 6. Yeah, 6 years old. But it's okay. They didn't consummate the marriage till she was 9. Yeah. So even at the time, that was considered a bit. You would at least wait until the girl had hit puberty. But after Muhammad's death, this big controversy breaks out because his followers couldn't quite agree on how to pass off the baton. Who should be the new lead caliph or leader after him? And this really split into 2 main factions, the Sunni and the Shia. The Sunni had elected Muhammad's father-in-law to be their new leader, while the Shia maintained that Muhammad's son-in-law should fill the role. Both groups claimed that before he died, this is what Muhammad told them. According to the Sunni, Muhammad said, after I die, you should elect your next leader. Whereas the Shia said, no, Muhammad said that before he died, He wanted his son-in-law to be the next leader, and they couldn't quite agree. And that was a pretty harsh divide that actually had a bit of violence between them. And that's actually a still dividing line between Muslim groups today, 1400 years later. The Shia claim that every Sunni ruler ever since then has been invalid, and that can lead to some pretty messy exchanges between the groups. Now, the Sunni are actually the larger group of the world's Islamic population. Somewhere between 85 to 90% of them are Sunni. And then the Shia are the smaller percentage, checking at about 10, 15%. Now, what are some of the main tenets of Islam? Well, these messages that Muhammad was said to have received through Gabriel from Allah. They were given over a period of 22 years, from about 610 to 632 AD. And these were written down and put into a collection called the Quran. The Quran is an Arab word meaning to read or to recite. And the Quran is a bit shorter than the Bible. It primarily focuses on the exclusivity and power of Allah. Again, it's extremely monotheistic. It focuses on Allah's power. It focuses on the importance of listening to Muhammad, his prophet. It provides guidance for righteous living. It gives very strong warnings of punishment if you disobey, very hearty promises of reward. In some places, the Quran, the language almost sounds like it's imitating the Bible. Some have actually accused it in some places of even sounding nonsensical. Sometimes it says things that I don't even know what that means. But we'll talk in just a minute about some of the differences between the Quran and the Bible. People have compared them. Where there is a comparison is that they are both holy books that the adherents live to and really stick by. But there's some pretty important differences as well, which we'll get to. The five pillars of Islam are kind of the five basic things that a faithful Muslim must abide by. It's not everything you need to do, but it's a pretty concise list. And you see there in your notes, for example, a profession of faith. A Muslim has to profess there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. A Muslim must pray 5 times a day, facing the city of Mecca, where Muhammad was from. Alms they must give to the poor. They must fast during sunlight hours every year during the 30 days of Ramadan. And pilgrimage would be the fifth. At some point in their life, a good Muslim, if possible, needs to go to Mecca at least once. Now, Muhammad taught that he worshiped none other than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the uncreated creator of all things, who has spoken through the prophets and who will judge the world someday. In that regard, it almost sounds like the God of the Bible. Muhammad even went so far as to affirm that Jesus was a prophet of the one true God. But here's where there's some deviation. Muhammad claimed that the Jewish and Christian traditions had actually distorted God's revelation over the years. And so, whatever God's original message to his people had been, the Jews and Christians had messed up. They had added stuff, they had taken stuff off, they had not preserved stuff accurately. And so now, aside from those core basic truths, basically the writings that God had given to these older prophets had now been so totally misconvoluted that fresh revelation was needed. A final definitive word was needed to reclarify who God is and what God had commanded. And so that's why Muhammad is considered the last and greatest prophet, because they would say Moses was a prophet, Jonah was a prophet, Jesus was a prophet, but their messages have all been messed up. And so this final definitive prophet, Muhammad, is needed to basically rewrite the book. The original book got so messed up. He's here to reclarify what it actually is. Now, what's important is that Muhammad denied the Trinity, and he denied any notion that God could actually have a son. Instead, he said that Jesus was a prophet, but merely a prophet, and that the Christians had severely misrepresented Jesus over the years. Instead, Muhammad not only did he deny the sonship, so he said that it was it's blasphemous to say that God could be a triunity of persons. It was blasphemous to say that God had a son. and he insisted that Jesus was nothing more than a prophet. But he even went a step further than that. Central to the Christian gospel is the doctrine that Jesus died on the cross. But Muhammad said, no, Jesus didn't actually die on the cross because Allah would never permit one of his prophets to be treated like that. Instead, he says that Jesus was taken directly up to heaven and someone else died instead. Some say that it was just a shadow of Jesus. Some say it was Judas who died in Jesus' place, but they thought they crucified Jesus, but they were wrong. Instead, Muhammad said, again, no Trinity, no Son of God, and no crucifixion. So the main tenets of Christianity he denied. So what were the Christian responses to this as this is cropping up and Muhammad is spreading his beliefs first just through sharing the word, but then later in a military fashion. He's raising armies and they're kind of enforcing this wherever they go. How does the church respond to this? Well, we could consider two main responses. The first is going to be political, or I'm sorry, the first is going to be theological in nature. The second is going to be political in nature. You recall by this time, many of the Christian rulers and kings or many of the kings and rulers are now Christians. And so they're going to have to deal with these Arab invaders. But then you've also got the Christian thinkers and churchmen and theologians. They're going to have to deal with Muhammad's claims that God is not a trinity and things like that. What does the church do? So let's examine those two spheres. First, let's consider the theological response. Now, unfortunately, there actually isn't as much Christian theological response as we would like. The church had some other internal things that it was wrestling over, and it didn't give as much attention to Islam as I think it probably should have. But that doesn't mean it didn't address it at all. There's a very prominent figure who spoke into this by the name of John of Damascus. John of Damascus lived from 675 to 749. He's going to play an important part in the next part of this lecture as well. We talk about the iconoclast controversy. John, being from Damascus, was actually Arabian himself, and he was a bit of a polymath. He did a little bit of everything. He was very well studied in theology, in philosophy, in law. He was an apologist. He was very musical and wrote hymns. He was a priest. He was a monk. For all of these various talents and more, he was nicknamed the Golden Stream because there's like golden rivers of knowledge and beauty are pouring from this guy. He's also considered one of the champions of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which next week we'll learn a little bit more about the difference between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. People sometimes conflate those and assume they're the same, but they're not. And John is a hero of the Orthodox Church. He was born again in Damascus, which is in Syria. That had primarily been a Christian area, but in 630, the Muslim armies conquered it. So now it's a very heavily Muslim area. And by the time John was born, there's still a Christian population there, including his family, but Islam is now the dominant faith. And so John was raised Christian, so he was very well versed in Christianity, but he also had a lot of exposure to the Islamic faith as well, because John and his father actually both worked for a Muslim caliph, a Muslim leader. Now, when he got a little bit older, John decided to leave and join a monastery, but he would have been exposed to this religion. On top of that, John had read Greek and Muslim writings. So although he is a deeply Orthodox Christian, John is extremely familiar with Greek philosophy, which you can see in a lot of his writings, and he's also very well versed in Islam as well. So John, in 743, writes a treatise called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Remember, the Arabs are descended from Ishmael. And so this treatise is actually John using his theological prowess and his firsthand familiarity with Islam to exploit some of its problems. And so he goes through some of its main teachings to show that even though Islam claims to be a recovery of what Judaism and Christianity lost, he says no, it's actually a heretical deviation from them both. He even uses language so strong as to call Islam a forerunner of the Antichrist, and he called Muhammad a false prophet. Now, what's interesting is that Today, many people want to claim that Muslims worship the same God as the Jews and the Christians. Some will classify them as different religions altogether. John would have seen it somewhere more in the middle, where by calling Islam a heresy, John actually saw it as a perverted spin off of Judeo Christianity. Um, I had a friend a couple of years ago who got a little upset because I referred to Islam as Christian fan fiction. And I was like, well, that's basically what it is. You have this established canon of the Judeo Christian view, and then Muhammad comes along and kind of writes his own spin off of it and changes some of the fundamental tenets involved. That's how John of Damascus certainly saw it. So John would recognize that certainly Islam agreed with certain tenets of Judeo Christianity. You know, there's one creator God, Bible characters such as Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham. There were prophets. There's a final day of judgment, that sort of thing. But Muhammad, like any heretic, took these types of terms and radically redefined them. So John definitely did not see this as just one branch of Christianity, but he also didn't see it as its own entirely new faith altogether. Rather, he saw it as sort of a leech. That's what a heresy is. It hijacks an existing faith system and redefines it in its own image. And that's how John saw Islam. So, what were some of the specific objections and contrasts that John raised? Well, first, he said the Quran was full of, quote, ridiculous compositions. Now, at first, that sounds like he's just being too easily dismissive of it. Basically, he's saying, oh, that's absurd. Well, why? Not because he denied the category of divine revelation. You know, Muhammad claims to have this word from God. Well, John doesn't dismiss that as problematic. John believes in the Bible. He believes God has spoken. Why does he think that the Quran is so ridiculous? Well, here's one reason is because this is to quote from John. When we ask the Muslim, who is there to testify that God gave him the book? And which of the prophets foretold that such a prophet would rise up? They are at a loss. End quote. In other words, Muhammad received his revelations privately. There were no witnesses to testify to it. There were no miracles to accompany Muhammad's ministry. There were no prophecies telling the people of God to be on the lookout for Muhammad, who was coming. You contrast that with some of the central revelations of the Bible that are given publicly and are accompanied by signs. So you think about the smoking mountain of Mount Sinai that all Israel sees, and the miracles that Moses does in their midst. You think about the miracles that Jesus does in public, the death and resurrection of Jesus, which are done publicly and seen by many witnesses. And you think about how those things were foretold ahead of time. So it was prophesied throughout the whole Old Testament that Jesus was coming, yet not a word that Muhammad was coming. And again, the Bible is full of witnesses who affirm these things, such as the apostles. But Muhammad met none of these criteria. So John asked the question, on what basis could someone consider Muhammad more authoritative than the Christian scriptures? John said that that Muhammad's Unitarian view of God, that is, God is not a trinity of persons, God is just one person. John claimed that Muhammad actually learned that from an Arian monk when he was younger. If you remember, Arianism was the heresy that said there is no Trinity. Jesus is a created being of God. And so John claims that that's where Muhammad kind of got that idea. But what's interesting is that John points out, hey, Muhammad is willing to call Jesus the Word. He thinks Jesus was the Word because he thinks Jesus was a prophet. And John and Muhammad actually called the Holy Spirit. He acknowledged that there was a Holy Spirit. He believed that that was Gabriel, the messenger. So Jesus is the Word, and the Holy Spirit is Gabriel. And yet John said it is ontologically absurd to call a being outside of God his word, or to call a being outside of God his spirit. Why? Because that would mean that God is dependent on another being outside of himself in order to have a word or in order to have a spirit. So if Jesus is God's word, then that means that in order to have a word, God needs this being who is outside of himself. And how did God speak before this created being? Same thing with the Spirit. The Spirit is the power of God. If the Spirit is a being outside of God, then God has no power apart from this created being. So if the Word is a person, he must be God. And if the Spirit is a person, he must be God. To deny this, John said that Muslims were mutilators of God. Uh, the other thing John did is he challenged Muhammad's moral credibility. And one of the ways that he did this is he would say, isn't it a coincidence that Muhammad gets these new revelations and laws just when he needs there to be some law in place that permits him to live a certain way? So he gives an example of on one occasion, he said Muhammad was getting real lusty for one of his friend's wives. And so he told his friend, oh, you know what? God's given me a command that you need to divorce your wife. So the man's, oh, okay. So he divorces her. And then Muhammad comes back later and says, well, now God has given me a command that I should take her as my wife. And there were other examples such as this that John said, that's a little too convenient. I don't think you can trust this guy's moral credibility. Now, John's arguments about the Bible, the Trinity, and Muhammad's character, those are at the heart of what are still good Christian apologetics towards Islam to this day. So, kind of thinking along the lines of John of Damascus, we can think of some contrasts. So, going back to the Quran versus the Bible, the Quran was written by one man over a span of 23 years. The Bible, by contrast, was written by over 40 men over a period of 1,000 years and spanning multiple continents. The Quran is this random collection of sayings and rules, but the Bible is one big story. It's a sprawling narrative that tells a tale from creation through the end of time, and it uses a variety of genres. It uses history, law, poetry, oracles, letters, apocalyptic literature, all kinds of stuff. The Bible is much more comprehensive in scope. It utilizes way more genres. It's written by more men. It's a much more sprawling work than the Quran. While like John pointed out, the revelations of the Bible were given publicly, and they were affirmed with witnesses, with miracles, with fulfilled prophecy. Should be noted that the Quran was revealed in secret. Muhammad performed no miracles, and he neither gave nor fulfilled any prophecies. So, as we're talking with our Muslim neighbors, we can point out some of these contrasts between our holy books. Talking about the Trinity, in the Christian Trinitarian conception of God, it can truly be said that God is love. Because if the one God is three persons, that means that God is, in essence, relational. You can't say that in Islam because Allah is only one person. And that creates a bit of a problem because in Islam, Allah requires a created being in order to love. Because in order for love to exist, there has to be a lover and a beloved. There has to be at least one other person that you give this affection towards. Love requires at least two. But if there was a point in eternity past when nothing else existed except for God or Allah as this singular person before all other beings, then that means either one of two things. He is not loved by essence because he was lonely. He was alone. There was nobody but him. There was nobody for him to love. And then, so that means he was without love at some point. But then, two, if he wants to love, then he would require some part of creation in order to be loved. God could not be loving without some created thing to make that love actualized. Only the doctrine of the Trinity can affirm that before all creation and apart from all creation, in his very intrinsic being, God is love. Now, the other thing we can point out is going back to that issue of moral character. So, after the escape to Medina, remember that Muhammad and his successors advanced Islam through the use of the sword. What a dramatic contrast this paints with what we've learned about early Christianity, Jesus Christ, and the first couple hundred years of the church, which involved the exact opposite. It was laying down one's life and advancing by means of preaching, discipleship, um, and uh, and being willing to die for the cause, not killing for the cause, but actually dying for the cause. It was a ministry of mercy and humility, not warfare. Now, it has been argued that Muhammad only called for violence against those who were first violent against the Muslims. Even if that's true, even that stands in contrast with Christ's command to love one's enemies and pray for those who persecute you. According to Muhammad's standards, the Christians should have taken up the sword and fought back against the Romans who were throwing them into lions, but they didn't. So either way, even if Muhammad was justified in his defense, it was still radically different than the way that the Christians advanced their cause. One other interesting difference between Jesus and Muhammad that we could talk about is Muslims affirm the goodness of Jesus, but Christians do not say the same thing about Muhammad. In fact, the character of Jesus is celebrated across almost all religions, and Muhammad is quite controversial. So I think that says something. All right, so that was the theological response to Islam from John of Damascus. Before we end this first point, let's consider the political response. Again, rulers at this time have become very Christianized. And so, how are they going to respond to this threat? And there's two noteworthy men who helped prevent that military spread of Islam. And this is important because were it not for these two guys, it's possible that the Muslim reign could have spread deep and violently into Christian territories. The Christian East and even Christian Europe might have been conquered. And Islam could very well have become the dominant world religion instead of Christianity. So the first guy we're going to consider, his name is Charles Martel. He was born in 686 and lived until 741. He was nicknamed the Hammer because he was a great leader in battle, and he led the group called the Franks. The Franks were from what is today France, and he filled a role called the mayor of the palace. Now there was technically a king at that time. This was the Merovingian dynasty, and they had been around for a couple centuries, but they had become more figureheads than anything. The real power of the Franks lay in this role of the mayor of the palace, and that was Charles. Charles was a strong proponent of the Roman Church. He supported and advocated for Christian missionaries. And in 719, there was a leading caliph who successfully conquered the Visigoths in what is today Spain. So, as this Muslim expansion is going on, one of their military campaigns comes up into Spain, basically conquers that territory. Now, I don't know if you have a map of the world handy, but if you were to look at that, you would notice that you would see that Spain, so you've got Africa here, you've got the Middle East, you've got Africa, and then here's Europe. Spain sits just above Africa. And then right above Spain is France. So Spain and France is sort of the gateway from Africa into all of Europe. Now, by this point, the Muslims had already conquered much of the Middle East and North Africa. And by conquering Spain, they had taken those first baby steps into the European continent. This put them right next to the Franks, which again is modern day France, and right next door to Italy, Germany, the United Kingdom, etc. And they are booming and they are conquering. And so this would have been a pretty frightening prospect for some of these Christian nations at the time. And as this happens, you can imagine the Caliph licking his lips and setting his sight on, oh, well, we've taken Spain. Now we take the Franks, and that opens up the door to the whole rest of Europe. And suddenly it seemed very possible that all of this territory that had been won for Christ over the last 700 years could, within a matter of years, fall to these Muslim conquerors. And so in the year 732, there was a very important battle called the Battle of Tours, in which Charles Martel, this leader of the Franks, goes to battle against these invading Islamic forces, and he defeats them, he clobbers them, and he sends them tumbling head over tail back to where they came from. And what this did is this stopped the Muslim advance up into the north, up into Europe. It sent them back into the Middle East and into North Africa, and it basically kept them out of Europe. All Muslim attempts to invade Europe at that point stopped. And that allows Europe to retain its unchallenged Christian identity. This is really important because in the following centuries, the Christian European context is what's going to lead to the Middle Ages, the art and beauty of the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, from where our heritage comes from, the age of exploration that's going to lead to the founding of America, the Industrial Revolution in Europe that leads to much of the modern technology, including the one that I'm using right now. So Charles Martel's victory at the Battle of Tours was so important because the church in Europe would not have developed the way that it did if the Muslims get in and expand their territory there. We might all be speaking Arabic right now. The next character to talk about is Emperor Leo III. He lived and died at almost the exact same time as Charles Martel, from 685 to 741. Now, I say Emperor Leo, that might be a little confusing. You think, wait a second, I thought the Roman Empire already fell. Well, if you remember from last week, Rome had actually been split into basically two empires, the East and the West. The Western Empire still had the city of Rome as its capital, and that's what fell to the barbarians in the 5th century. But the Eastern Empire, with Constantinople as its capital, that was going to stand strong for another 1,000 years. And that became known as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is what Emperor Leo reigned over. Now, because the Byzantine Emperor or the Byzantine Empire was in the East, that put it pretty close to the Arab nations. And so it became a bit of a target, especially because there was some internal strife. So there was trouble in paradise in the Byzantine Empire at a point, and that internal conflict made them somewhat susceptible. And the expanding Muslim warlords realized that, and they wanted to seize on that opportunity, and they sought to invade the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was also this sort of this Disney world of Christian culture, and now it's very, very suddenly threatened by these potential Muslim invaders. And so they attempted to swoop in and destroy Constantinople. This would have been a huge blow against the church because if you remember last week, we talked about how Constantinople was this haven of Christian thought and education and art. And if you're conquered by the Muslims, then that would have reversed all the Christianity that had been permeating there over all these years. And yet, this Byzantine Emperor Leo III was able to withstand the attacks upon Constantinople, and he was able to repel the Islamic attackers to return home. And so the Christian kingdoms in Western Northern Europe have been protected, and now the Christian kingdoms of the East have also been protected from Muslim invasion, and that would allow the church to continue and grow there as well. So we spent a good bit of time talking about the rise of Islam, some of the Christian theological responses to it, but then even the very real threats that it posed to growing Christianity of the day. And thankfully, God was providentially working through theologians like John of Damascus, but also these leaders like Charles Martel and Leo III. And for a time, Emperor Leo was understandably this hero of Christendom. But as we will see in our next section, that hero status was not to last long. He's going to go on to make some moves that are going to make a lot of people upset. So in just a sec, we'll go on to our second section of tonight's lecture. All right, so we are on section 2, and I do have a cough drop in my mouth now, so hopefully that rattling around doesn't get too loud or obnoxious. But the iconoclast controversy arises around the same time because by this point, images had become a very prominent feature in the church. There's images of Jesus, there's images of the saints, there's images of Bible stories, and these were frequently used not just for decoration, but they were to stir up people's emotions as they would contemplate Christ and his word. And another word for these images was icon. That's what the word means. And the word iconoclast means image smasher. So it was someone who would take these images and would basically break them. Now, we just talked about Emperor Leo III, who was a hero for keeping the Muslims out of the Byzantine Empire, but this same Leo had a big problem with the use of images in churches. He believed that it violated the second commandment. in Exodus 20, where God said not to make a carved image out of anything. And he especially objected to using images of Jesus because if we're doing our theology, remember, Jesus is God, and God had told the Israelites in Deuteronomy 4 not to depict God in any tangible form. So if Jesus is God, wouldn't it be blasphemous to portray him in any sort of image? And so Emperor Leo banished the use of images in the church. He would forcibly remove them and would even destroy them, hence the name iconoclast and image smasher. Leo said that the church's use of images was actually just a carryover from paganism. So, the heathens would have their statues of their gods that they would worship. And so the Christians were just doing the same thing. They were taking this pagan practice of depicting the holy in a statue and then using it in this reverent, devout way. And it was just basically just a carryover from paganism. He said if you wanted to encounter Jesus, you couldn't do that through a tangible image. That could only happen in the mind and in the heart. Now, Leo was met with a lot of pushback because by this time, the Eastern and the Western churches are beginning to crack a bit. We'll talk about that more next week. The Eastern Church's main leader by this point is the Patriarch of Constantinople. The West's main leader is the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And yet there is at least agreement on this one thing they can come together on. Leo was wrong in wanting to get rid of these images. Now, although the resistance to the emperor's decree, so Emperor Leo III, he is not a bishop, he is not a pope, he is not a priest, he is not a monk, he is a ruler of an empire. And he has now issued this decree about what churches may or may not do. So even though they theologically disagree with him on that, I think there's a deeper issue involved as well. I think there's also a huge political disagreement there as well, because the church clergy would have probably rightfully said political rulers like emperors do not have the authority to dictate what the church does theologically or in its worship. The emperor does not have authority to tell the church how it ought to worship. That is something for church leaders to determine. Now, this is important because we see this all throughout the history of the church where there's this built-in limitation on the power of kings that that the church provides this bulwark against. And even when you have an absolute ruler like an emperor, the church stands up and says, "Hey, your power only goes thus far, bub." And this is going to be a source of controversy between kings and popes and bishops all throughout the Middle Ages. But in this instance, the church says to Leo III, "You're overstepping your bounds. You can't tell us to do that." But not only did they have that political disagreement with him, there was also a big theological disagreement as well. So he said that to use images was idolatry. The church came back and gave their arguments about why it was acceptable, why it was not idolatry. So, in addition to protecting the church from political interference, there's several layers of theological responses to Emperor Leo's policies. So let's consider a couple of those. First, those who were in favor of using images, so we'll call them the anti-iconoclasts. Remember, the iconoclasts want to smash the images, and the anti-iconoclasts want to keep them. They're against smashing the images. They would draw a distinction between worship and veneration. They would say that worship is giving this adoration to a divine being, whereas veneration is simply an act of respect towards an important person or thing. They said there's nothing wrong with venerating things, and that's all we're doing with these. We're treating these images of these saints and even of Jesus. We're showing honor to them, we're respecting them. We're not worshiping them. Secondly, they said that the use of images actually aided the affection of the heart. So if you remember, I just said a couple minutes ago, Leo actually drew this sharp distinction between what you see with your eyes, these images, and then what's done in the heart, honor and worship. He said It shouldn't be about the images with the eyes. Seeing this picture of Jesus, it's all about the worship you do of him in your heart. And the anti-iconoclasts said, well, that's a false dichotomy. They said that the former could actually aid the latter, that the use of images that you see with your eyes could actually aid and assist the stirring of the heart towards proper worship, because the image itself is not the goal. Rather, the image reminds you of the real thing, and by looking at the image, it stirs up your affection for the actual thing. So, a modern example I would think of would be the way that someone treasures a photograph of a loved one. Yeah, and you probably treat it with some respect. Uh, you don't use it as a Kleenex, or you don't use it to clean the counters. If you've got this picture of a loved one, especially one who is deceased, you're gonna put it in a nice frame, and you're gonna hang it up somewhere on a mantelpiece, and you're gonna show great respect to it. And when you look at that picture, you don't think that picture is them, but it's summoning up all these memories and feelings towards the person. You don't think that the ink and the paper themselves are anything special, but because they are a testimony to the person, and therefore the photograph is treated with a similar type of dignity you might show the person. And just like that picture can stir up real affection for the person who's not there with you, they argued that so too images, including images of Christ, could help stir up affection for Jesus or for the saints who weren't actually there. Another argument used by the anti-iconoclasts is the third thing is they said it was very practical for teaching the illiterate. It's surprising to us if we were to encounter an adult or even an older child who can't read. It would be surprising if someone said, "Oh, I've never been able to get my hands on a Bible before." We live in a society where most people can read, and Bibles are readily accessible everywhere. But that was not true in the 8th century. Most of your common folk could not read, and the printing press hadn't been invented yet. So there weren't printed editions of the Bible on every shelf and in every hotel drawer. They were much rarer to come across. However, everyone knows pictures. If you have eyes, you can look at a picture and tell what's going on. Uh, Gripping pictures can tell stories where maybe someone can't read words. And so many of the people who were filling the churches in the 8th century couldn't read. They didn't have regular access to the Bible, but they could see images. And so these icons, it was argued, helped communicate Bible stories. The icon of Jesus helped preach or share the gospel, and the icons of saints helped relate to them the history of the church. So they're learning the Bible, they're learning who Jesus is, they're learning about the history of the church through these images. Another point of argument that was used, the fourth thing is they say it's different than how pagans use images. Remember, Leo had argued that the use of images was just a carryover from what the pagans would do. And one of the arguments used by the anti-iconoclasts is that when pagans made an idol, they thought that the sum and substance of their god was seen in that statue of him. This would ultimately make that God compact, comprehensible, and limited. But Christians didn't believe that a picture of Jesus encompassed the fullness of the Godhead. They said the fullness of God cannot even be known, much less depicted. Rather, images of Jesus, it was not condensing God into an image, it was merely a representation of the human nature of Jesus. They did not think that an image summarized the entirety of the unknowable divine nature. It merely represented his humanness that he had made known in the incarnation. Fifthly, and I think probably their biggest argument that they used is uh, the anti-iconoclasts pointed out God had indeed forbidden people from depicting the divine nature in any physical form. God is not a physical entity. God does not have a body like us. And so it would be impossible and utterly blasphemous to try to depict that in a physical form. But in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the invisible God made himself visible. In fact, isn't that the entire marvel of the gospel? Is that the incomprehensible and infinite God revealed himself in a comprehensible and finite way in the man Jesus Christ. So the anti-iconoclasts would argue we should not try to depict the divine nature in an image. They said it is acceptable and even beneficial to depict the person of Jesus Christ insofar as his human nature is concerned. And that's a very important distinction. I said Jesus is one person, but with two natures. His divine nature, like God himself, cannot be pictured or visualized with images. Don't even try it. But Jesus in the gospel, Jesus did take on flesh and blood. He did have a face. He did have real physical features that could be physically seen and experienced. And the invisible God became visible. And that's a tremendous benefit that we should be excited to be able to remember, to encounter. So those were some of the arguments they used for saying the use of images can actually be quite helpful. Now, a couple notable characters we should note. There's only two we're going to look over. These were some of the main guys who were opposing the iconoclasts. First, our buddy John of Damascus, where we talked about him earlier, and he wrote something called "The Defense Against Those Who Oppose Holy Images." Defense against those who oppose holy images. And there's a pretty long quotation in there that if you have your notes, I'll let you go ahead and read. The other gentleman was Theodore the Studite. He came about a century after John. He wrote something called the First Refutation of the Iconoclasts. And what you'll find in these quotes is basically what I've already summarized for you. A lot of it, it's very Christological, centers a lot on Jesus, where because God has been incarnate uh, in this person of Jesus, it's perfectly acceptable to depict Jesus as incarnate. Now, this is a topic that still has a lot of relevancy to us today because it's still a very complex one. So, a lot of Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox still have a lot of images in their churches. Of course, if you look at a Protestant cross necklace, you'll notice that it's empty. If you look at a Roman Catholic cross necklace called a crucifix, you'll notice there's a picture of Jesus on that cross. You'll see pictures of saints and characters in these churches. You'll see a lot of artwork depicting a lot of holy figures and images of Jesus all over the place. In some of these churches, they'll even direct prayers or petitions to these figures that the images represent. Now, most Protestants are uncomfortable with that, directing prayers or requests towards images. But not all Protestants agree on just what they are or are not comfortable with. So some churches might be okay with having pictures of Bible stories, painted on their halls or a painting in the foyer or in the kids' Sunday school room or something. But in a lot of these churches, you won't find very many pictures of figures from church history. You ever thought about that? Why is that? Well, because that feels too much like depicting the saints. It feels a little too close to saint veneration for them, so you won't see that. Some churches are comfortable with pictures of Jesus, but not in a place of worship. That way, you won't even subconsciously direct your worship towards that image. So imagine walking down a church hallway and there's an image in the hall of Jesus carrying a lamb. Okay, great, inspiring. But then you go to worship, and at the front of the church, there's this portrait of Jesus. And as you're praying, you maybe find yourself directing that prayer towards this picture of Jesus. And so some churches will say, we're okay with Jesus, but not pictures of Jesus in a place where we might begin to worship the image. Some Christians are okay with visual depictions of Jesus, like in a painting, but not media depictions, meaning like in a film. No human actor can ever totally nail the part of God the Son incarnate. So some will say we shouldn't make movies about Jesus, basically, because you're always getting a very slanted depiction of him. Some groups like Presbyterians, they don't approve of images of Jesus at all for the same reason as the iconoclasts. They would say that if Jesus is God, then to depict Jesus is to depict God. Therefore, we should not do it. So there's a lot of complexity here, a lot of gray area. There should be a lot of, I think, grace, but also a lot of conviction as well. And whatever your stance is, I think it's helpful to know this is an issue that's been debated for a long time. And it's very helpful to be familiar with the arguments on both sides of this issue. Um, let's go ahead now to our third and final part of this lecture, and that is going to be the Vikings. If you are looking at the notes, this is going to be on page 12. The Vikings are a group primarily from Scandinavia. Scandinavia is a region made up of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It's a very cold but very beautiful region, and the folks living there were often known as the Northmen. Why? Because they were so far up north. They would often live in cottages that were in villages. These villages were often overseen by a local king, lord, or he would often be called the chieftain of sort of a tribe. And very often, this chieftain would live in this long house that was called a mead hall. It was a mead hall because you'd go to this hall and you would drink a whole lot of mead. These Northmen were very fond of their alcoholic drinks. I'm sure it kept them very warm in those cold winters. And have you ever seen pictures of mead halls and of sort of the Scandinavian dress and armor and weapons? You can see the inspiration behind Rohan in The Lord of the Rings, which is probably more on the Anglo-Saxon side of things, but very similar types of cultures. When Gandalf and Aragorn arrive at Edoras, you look at it and you think, oh wow, that looks like one of the old mead halls. But many of these Scandinavians were farmers, they were fishermen, they were merchants. You'd often see them wearing these very thick coats of fur that would protect them against the harsh winter. But this crowd could also be quite rowdy. They loved their mead and their strong drink. They loved feasting. That's what these mead halls would be used for. They loved their women very much, and they also loved fighting. They loved brawling with each other. They would either fight each other for fun, or they would go out and they would slay enemies. There was great honor. The prize, the highest prize you could achieve was to be this glorious warrior. That was the test of manhood, of greatness. Was what a warrior you were. And since many of these Norsemen lived near the water, they were also explorers. And they built a very famous type of ship called a long ship. And you've probably seen pictures of them before. They're very lean and narrow. They have square sails. And there's usually some kind of mythological figurehead on either end. And then there's oars sticking out both sides. And these long ships were very sturdy, very well built, so you could take them over long distances. But because they were thin, you could also maneuver them quite quickly and easily. And these Northmen would take their long ships and they would go explore new territories. It was considered fairly normal to pillage, kill, even steal women from your rivals. That was just kind of standard fare. Now, you didn't like it when people did it to you to pillage, kill, and rape, but it was pretty acceptable for you to go and do it to someone else. Now, these waterfront Northmen, as they have their better ships, they begin branching out. Instead of just raiding the other settlements on the same land as them, they begin going further out to other lands and they begin pillaging, killing, and raping in those areas as well. And these guys become known as the Vikings. Now, we want to be fair because we shouldn't assume that all Scandinavians were these bloodthirsty marauders. Many of them were just peaceful farmers or tradesmen. They wanted to honor the gods. They wanted to survive the harsh conditions. They wanted to raise a family. But there were many of them who were these Vikings who wanted to explore out and go conquer these other areas. The Vikings were not, it wasn't like the Roman Empire where it's one big unified nation under a single emperor. Rather, they were these scattered collections of tribes under different chiefs. Uh, if there was anything that unified the Vikings, it would be a lot of their culture was very similar, and they worshipped a lot of the same similar gods. Not always the same local gods, but some of the big gods of Norse mythology they would have in common, such as Odin. You know, he was kind of the king of the gods, or Thor, the god of thunder and war, or Loki, sort of the mischievous trickster god. And They all looked forward to this afterlife called Valhalla. Valhalla was like every good Viking's dream. You would eat and drink all day long. Then you'd go out into this giant battlefield and you would just hack each other to smithereens in glorious, bloody battle. And then you would sleep and you would wake up and you wouldn't have a hangover and your body would be put back together and you'd be fully intact and you'd do it all over again. And that was their idea of heaven. Now, we've already discussed how, when we talked about the monks and the monastic life a couple lectures ago, we've talked about how early individual monks began banding together to form these places called monasteries. And we've talked about how St. Augustine of Canterbury brought the gospel to Britain, or what became known as England. And so, as a result, many monasteries of monks are being planted in Britain. Many of these monasteries could be found on small islands right off the British coast or maybe right near the seaside. This seemed really helpful at first because it allowed you isolation from the rest of society. That's what the monks were looking for. And it provided you good means of contemplation while you're out in nature. So if you're familiar with sort of Britain's setup at all, you know there's all sorts of little tiny islands. Britain is one big island, and you've got all these other little rocky islands kind of right off the coast. And it was on a lot of these little islands that they would build these monasteries. And so the monks would live in community with each other, but kind of shut away from everything else. If you go back to that world map that I had you look at earlier, you'll also notice there's a little bit of sea between the Scandinavian countries over here and then the British islands over here. And so as these Northmen venture out further and further in their longships, it's not too long before they find their way to these British islands where the monasteries are. In 793, these Vikings found their way to a place called Lindisfarne Monastery. That was in Northumbria, Britain. And what a pleasant surprise awaited the Vikings there as they found out here's this large settlement. It's got lots of resources and treasure. The Christians had devoted these treasures to God, and yet there were no fighting men there to man it. It was protected by these non-violent monks who had no desire or ability to fight. This is what you would call easy pickings because here's this unprotected place full of treasures and supplies, and no one's going to fight you for it. And so they were able to sweep right in and take it pretty easily. There was this document called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle written in the 12th century, and here's how it describes it. In that same year, 793, the pagans from the northern regions came with a naval force to Britain like stinging hornets and spread on all sides like fearful wolves, robbed, tore, and slaughtered not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons and companies of monks and nuns. And they came to the church of Lindisfarne, laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars, and seized all the treasures of the holy church. They killed some of the brothers, took away some of them in fetters. Many they drove out naked and loaded with insults. Some they drowned in the sea. Pretty vivid picture of what these Vikings did to these monasteries. And there was a clergyman from Northumbria, from that same area. His name was Alcuin, and he wrote this to the king of Northumbria in a letter. He says, quote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples." Now, this unprovoked barbarism shocked the Europeans because they had not done anything to irk them. These guys just came out of nowhere across the sea and without any provocation just began slaughtering and hacking. And this raid in 793 is what's known to historians as the start of the Viking Age. And it was that, only a beginning. Just like a few ants, who discover a crumb, might go back and tell the entire colony. And then before long, the whole colony comes out and swarms. Well, these initial raiders from Scandinavia are going to go back home and say, guys, we found these treasure troves that are not protected, and these weakling guys who die really easily. Well, it'd only be a matter of time before the rest of the ants would begin to swarm. And yet, there's an incredible irony here. And the thing about ironies is you can't usually tell that it's an irony in the moment when it first begins. Only when you look back on it can you really appreciate the full irony of the situation. The irony is this is that when the Viking raids upon those monasteries first began, the Vikings could not have possibly known that they were actually sowing the seeds of their own undoing. Because in time, those conquerors of Christ's monasteries would themselves be conquered by Christ because of their contact with these Christian settlements. Within a matter of years, these Vikings themselves would actually be Christianized. Now, at first, when these Vikings first learn about Christianity, like the Romans before them, they are repulsed at the idea of worshiping a crucified man. Remember, the epitome of a Viking was one who was strong and mighty and who could conquer his foes. Death was a sign of weakness and defeat. So why on earth would Jesus be so celebrated if he was slain? Wouldn't isn't that a testimony to his weakness? And yet over time, this is really interesting. Over time, another aspect of the gospel story becomes impressive to the Vikings. Not just that of Christ's crucifixion, but of his resurrection, his ascension, and his reign. Because as we know, the story of Jesus didn't end with his death. That's only the setup for his cosmic triumph over death, hell, and all other spiritual principalities, including the Nordic gods. Because the Christians said, hey, we believe that Odin, Thor, and Loki, we believe that they're real entities. We just think that they're demons. And Jesus has risen from the dead and has now triumphed over all of these entities and demons by ascending and reigning over all. And so the very thing that struck the Vikings as so repulsive actually ended up winning them over because they were impressed by strength and victory. And they began to see that, wow, this crucified guy on the cross who appears beaten actually turns out to be the mightiest hero of all. And that went a long way in actually winning them over. Now, a couple notable characters we could talk about with the Vikings. The first one to consider is a guy named Saint Ansgar. He lived from 801 to 865. He's known as the Apostle to the North. Remember we talked last week about Patrick, who's the Apostle to the Irish, or Augustine of Canterbury, who is the Apostle to England. Well, Saint Ansgar is known as the Apostle to the North, and he's actually considered the patron saint of Scandinavia. Ansgar was educated at a Benedictine monastery. If you remember last week, we learned about the Benedictine order, and eventually Ansgar entered ministry. Now, supposedly, what got him into ministry was when he was younger, his mother had died, and he supposedly had this vision of his mother in heaven with the Virgin Mary. And that is sort of what prompted him into ministry. He was the first to bring the gospel into Sweden, and he built the first church there. That's important. There's about 3,500 churches in Sweden today, and that goes back to Ansgar. He builds the very first. Sweden was a very significant source of Viking exploration and raiding. It's a pretty significant spot in Viking culture. And in addition to Sweden, he also evangelized in Denmark and in parts of Germany. Now, as with missionaries we've already studied, like Patrick, Augustine, Boniface, Ansgar's strategy was typically to start with the king of that region. And once you get in the king's good graces, you get permission to then preach there. And one of the kings that Ansgar started with and won favor with was named Horik the First of Denmark. Now, Horik was not a Christian, but he favored Ansgar and even allowed him to build a church there. And today there's over 2,600 churches in that area. Now, eventually, this we'll get a little drama here. Eventually, civil war breaks out between Horik the First and his son, Horik the Second. Horik the First is favorably disposed towards Christianity. Horik the Second is not. And so he shuts down Ansgar's church. Hey, I know my dad said it was okay. but I'm the new boss in town. I'm changing the rules. I'm shutting down your church. And it seems like all of that effort Ansgar had put into this journey uh, in Denmark was going to be all for nothing. But Ansgar didn't give up that easily. He actually spent more time with the king. And Horik II ended up being won over, not to Christianity, but to Ansgar's character, because Ansgar proved himself to be a man of deep integrity. And so Horik II kind of shifted his favor and said, you know what, Ansgar, I've changed my mind. I am okay with you doing that, because he saw what a reputable guy Ansgar was. Again, the king himself didn't convert, but he did allow Ansgar to reopen that shut down church and begin planting more churches. And so Ansgar's efforts ended up introducing Christianity to Denmark, and eventually it earned toleration amongst there's long-standing heathenism there. And by the year 965, so within a relatively short amount of time now, there was a king by the name of King Harold Bluetooth, and he actually announces Christianity to be the official religion of Denmark. And that was due to the tireless efforts, but also to the upright moral character of this missionary, Ansgar. Now, I told you about how Harold Bluetooth made that the official religion of Denmark in 965, but that was long after Ansgar's time. Ansgar did actually not see much success in his own lifetime. In fact, much of his work would often seem to be undone before his very eyes. In addition to that, he faced constant danger from the hostile pagans who were against his work. And during the last couple of years of his life, he suffered greatly from very serious intestinal problems. Ansgar really wanted to die as a martyr. He admired these heroes of old, and he wanted to lay down his life for Christ, but it was not to be. It's that he would die of natural causes, probably of a fever, with this painful condition, and that seems so inglorious compared to the flames of glory he wanted to go out in. And yet Ansgar's friends reminded him that his whole life had been one of continuous martyrdom. He constantly, for years, laid down his life for the cause of Christ. He had left the safety of his homeland and the opportunities for success there. He had devoted himself to simplicity and caring for the poor. He was even known to literally wash the feet of the poor wherever he went. And he forged a gospel trail in Sweden and Denmark when there was danger lurking on all sides. So he really was a martyr, but kind of a perpetual martyr, we might say. And so there is much that we can learn from the life of Ansgar. A couple things that I think we should keep in mind before we get ready to wrap up. One is that Ansgar won credibility wherever he went, not simply due to his dynamic preaching, although he certainly was a good preacher, but because of his personal holiness and his admirable qualities. Ansgar is a reminder to us that boldly speaking the truth and sanctified living should go hand in hand. Moral integrity is a tremendous apologetic to the message we bear. This pagan king was ready to shut down Ansgar's mission, and yet when he saw the integrity of his life, his trustworthiness of character, he was willing to let him continue, and God worked through that. Secondly, we don't always see the fruit of our labor in our own lifetime. From our perspective, our efforts might seem to be a failure, and yet our call is not to be caught up in the results. Our call is to be faithful to what Jesus has called us to do, and then we trust his providential purposes. So that with Ansgar, if he were to look at the immediate results in front of him, he might say, man, I feel like a failure. But as his friends reminded him, you have laid down your life to be faithful to Jesus, and you let Jesus take care of the rest. And Jesus was faithful to work through that. And this comes by remembering that you and I are a small part in a much larger story. This is Jesus's story, and what he is doing in this world will outlive us. Our job is to be faithful. And I think Ansgar would be overjoyed if he saw the fruit that his labor would produce in the years that came after him. And then the last thing we can learn from him is that a blaze of martyr's glory is not always the highest mark of a Christian witness. Sometimes it's not always the big dramatic sacrifice of, being burned at the stake or being ripped apart by lions. Sometimes to lay down our life for Christ, to have a martyr's attitude, is doing the same faithful, frustrating and glorious things day after day, year after year, until Christ decides our work is done. If you have your notes, there's a couple other characters you could go and you could read about. I've got a little bit more information on Harold Bluetooth there. He was the king of Denmark. Um, we've got King Olaf Tryggvason. He was a king of Norway who basically made Christianity the required religion there. You can read about with King Olaf. Didn't so he had good intentions, but he unfortunately tried to enforce that with violence sometimes. And so he introduced Christianity into Norway legally, which was good as the king. But it would actually be another king who came after him, Olaf II Haraldsson, who would actually help win the hearts of people with Christianity. And then we have the figure Leif Erikson there. He was a very famous Viking explorer who actually he discovered North America 500 years before Columbus did. And Leif Erikson had actually converted to Christianity. And the reason why Leif Erikson accidentally discovered North America is because he was on his way to Greenland to share the gospel there and actually missed Greenland in a storm and passed it and ended up in North America himself. So, and all of these different characters, we see the gospel work continuing to go out. We've seen how, despite the threats of Islam, despite the threats of the Vikings, and even despite the internal disagreements about iconoclasm, Jesus continues to build his church. He's worked through rulers to providentially protect his people so that Europe didn't fall to the Muslims, even though the monks seemed uh, really endangered as a result of these Viking raiders. Yet the Prince of Peace would ultimately conquer them. And as we consider images, we think about what is proper for our worship and how we properly live out the fact that our uh, invisible God has now become invisible in Christ. And so I hope that this just spurs greater contemplation for you. And if you have any questions about today's lecture, then I would encourage you to please reach out and I'd love to hear from you. So thanks, guys.